where are these people going to come from who are going to fight on the front lines in Ukraine? There aren't many left. Even if we wanted to keep supplying the weapons, we simply don't have it because we've been fueling and arming far too many wars, our own, Israel's, Ukraine's, and that's what happens.
So Glenn Greenwald recently had a podcast about Trump's recent decision to suspend some munition shipments to Ukraine. What does this mean for overall prospects of peace there? What does it mean for the Trump administration? And what does it do to U.S.-Russian relations? Glenn's one of the greatest journalists of our time, so let's get his take on it. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
I had several people on my show from the start who were vehement opponents of U.S. financing, NATO financing of the war in Ukraine. Jeffrey Sachs was one. John Mearsheimer was another. Stephen Walt was another. We had several people. We had members of Congress who were Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene, part of the MAGA movement, Rand Paul as well, RFK Jr., when he was running for president, we had a lot of people. But Professor Mearsheimer and Jeffrey Sachs and Stephen Walt in particular were overwhelmingly prescient in predicting what would happen, even though at the time you weren't allowed to say this, because if you said reality, you would get accused of being a Russian propagandist or pro-Kremlin or all the things they use to smear people who are questioning the prevailing propaganda.
Oh, yeah.
Just like we saw in this last war, if you questioned U.S. bombing of Iran or the Israeli attack on Iran, you were accused of being pro-Mullah, loving the Ayatollahs, same thing every time. And one of the things they were saying is like, look, it doesn't matter how many weapons you give to Ukraine. It doesn't matter how much money you hand to Kiev. Even if it didn't get all sucked up in the massive corruption that has long governed Ukraine, which of course it will, but let's assume it didn't. Let's assume it was a very honest, well accounted for country driven by integrity and principle, and all the money was used for exactly what it was earmarked for. Even if that happened, and even if the Ukrainian people were incredibly courageous, and they were actually at the beginning, they clearly, there's a behavior, dog behavior that I've seen so many times. If you go to a dog park and two dogs are going to fight and they're on neutral ground, no one owns the dog park, the stronger dog is likely to win. But if you took those same dogs and the weaker dog in the dog park was at home and the stronger dog in the dog park went to the house of the weaker dog, the weaker dog will suddenly become very strong. And typically, I'm not saying in all cases, obviously a poodle and a Rottweiler, it's going to be the same result. But I'm saying in when it's even remotely close, when you're defending your home, and this is definitely true in the canine world, they fight much more passionately, much more aggressively, much more confidently.
Yeah, and also wars of defense are much easier to sell to a populace. We saw that with Iran, too. They were struck first by Israel in that attack against a residential complex. And we saw that, unlike the neocon propaganda that this would stir up rebellious groups within the country to potentially overthrow it and enact regime change, it only solidified the patriotic spirit behind Iranian nationalism. I think we saw that in Ukraine too. But what Glenn said earlier is so true about the corruption in Ukraine. And at one point recently, Zelensky dropped his mask on this when he said, hey, everyone in the U.S. talks about how they've given us $200 billion, but we've only seen about $100 billion of it. Well, that was saying the quiet part out loud and dropping the mask a little bit, because that shows how much war profiteering there has been from this whole scheme. The Lockheed Martins and Raytheons and Boeings and Northrop Grummans of the world have profited immeasurably from this, and all the other military contractors and forces that feed into this, the bankers that finance it, that make money off of debt. This is all part of the U.S. war machine and how it's funded and financed. So, yeah, I'm with Glenn here.
And I think that's the same for human beings. And so the Ukrainians were very feisty, very punching above their weight at the beginning. But even so, and all these people on my show said it, and I got convinced that it was true from the very start, even if everything went right for the Ukrainians, even if you give them everything they want, the simple fact that Russia is so much bigger and that this is going to be a ground war of attrition between two neighboring countries meant that inevitably Russia was going to win. It might take a year, it might take 2 years, it might take 5 years. But the only possibility is that the Ukrainian population of young men And as they expanded the draft, it became middle-aged, young to middle-aged men were going to be obliterated. We're going to disappear. And so obviously were huge numbers of young Russian men, but they have so many more that they can just keep replenishing them and lose that amount without having any real effect on Russia. Russia's like a gigantic country.
And, conscription in any state is a crime. If you're asking me, it's a form of slavery. And in some ways, it's the worst form of slavery. It's slavery to the state, drawn into the service of killing others. And that's, in some ways, the worst form of slavery. Obviously, chattel slavery, historically is immeasurably horrific, too. But Glenn is right here. But, the only reason that the Ukrainians were really punching above their weight is because of all the Western, NATO, and U.S. money flowing into it. And you can just take off the table everything they want because they wanted a no-fly zone, which would have guaranteed a hot war with Russia. Article 5 of the NATO treaty would have been cited and invoked by several powers to send in hot troops. And they wanted U.S. troops on the ground. Why wouldn't they? They want to fight against Russia. This lofty notion of regime change has been floated out there in Russia, and it's absolutely preposterous. It's something no one in the U.S. wants to accept. Even the fiercest supporters of funding and financing and U.S. involvement in this war in Ukraine aren't putting on the table, we need to send U.S. troops there, and for good reason. Lindsey Graham's out there and saying this is the best money America ever spent because others are fighting and dying for this war that is in America's benefit. Well, it's not whatsoever. And it's essentially been, the same thing for about a year. The last Ukrainian real offensive was in, I believe, July of 2024. And all of that was pushed back by the beginning of 2025 for the most part. Russia occupies most of the Donbass and isn't going back. There's no indication that Ukraine is going to make inroads there despite all of this funding. And hopefully Trump is finally realizing that to some extent.
And that's what's happened between the people who were killed in Ukraine, the people who fled and deserted, and there are a lot of them. There's basically a generation of Ukrainian men missing, which in turn means women aren't dating and aren't marrying. It destroys the whole society.
That's true, and Zelensky has only tried to expand their conscription mandates to make it feasible to draft older men. There's a dying generation of Ukrainian men. This is not unlike the U.S. Civil War was in the United States, where, you had huge swaths of certain areas of Ukraine that are fighting and dying there. I've heard potential statistics of somewhere between 800,000 and 1.3 million dead Ukrainians. It's hard to fully know. There's lots of different opinions on how many have died, and the propagandists have tried to keep this completely under wraps in the veneer of supporting this whole monstrosity. And over the last 2 years, pretty much, the last time we really heard any promises that there was going to be a change was in 2023. There was going to be this great counterattack during the summer. And like David Petraeus and Max Boot and all the people who promised the same thing was going to happen in Iraq with the surge, were there telling us, no, this counterattack is going to change everything. It didn't change anything. Russia has maintained the 22, 23, 24% of Ukraine that they occupy. And they've been expanding it, and they're expanding it more and more. And there's no way to stop that unless you send in NATO troops or U.S. troops to have a direct war with Russia, which would by definition be World War III. And not even those insane Europeans. The EU has these I'm going to say they're primarily women, and I say that because a lot of left-wing parties in Europe ran explicitly on the idea that they were going to put women in foreign policy positions because women are less likely to be militaristic, warmongering, seeking conflict. They're much more likely to rely on diplomacy to resolve disputes because it's more in the woman nature. This was the feminist argument, this very essentialist and reductive view of how women and men resolve conflicts. And instead, you look at these warmongers in Europe, they're like Ursula von der Leyen, who's the president of the EU. Nobody elected her. She's a maniac, a sociopath. The foreign affairs minister is the former prime minister of Estonia. It's like 1 million people. There's also Hillary Clinton and Nancy Pelosi to add to that mix.
She's now like the foreign minister. She goes around demanding more and more war. And then the Green Party in Germany is the worst. They ran on this feminist foreign policy explicitly. And they have Annalena Broderick as the foreign minister. And she is, I mean, you listen to her and she sounds like something out of 1939 talking about the glories of war.
He's right.
And even with all that, the Europeans aren't going to send in troops. The Americans aren't going to send in troops. And so the more we prolong this war, the more we destroy Ukraine, the country, and the more we sacrifice the lives of Ukrainians. And that has been the neocon argument. It's like, you don't have to worry. Americans aren't dying. It's the Ukrainians who are dying. Remember, they're not fighting voluntarily. They're conscripted. A lot of them are fleeing. A lot of them are deserting.
You don't have to worry except for all the inflation that destroys your wealth back at home. The national debt that's at now $37 trillion. The civil liberties that will get curtailed and you canceled by, expressing dissenting views on this and then being called anti-American, anti-Ukrainian, pro-Russian, pro-Kremlin, Russian agent. We've all heard it all. There's sweeping ramifications that always touch the United States because of these stupid wars, these proxy wars of choice.
They just don't have the people to fight. Now, over the last couple of weeks, there has been announcements that the U.S. is going to slow down or stop certain weapons transfers that had previously been allocated under the Biden administration. One of the people who is announcing this, who's deciding this, is Elbridge Colby. And you may remember that Elbridge Colby was one of the people that the neocons tried so hard to stop his confirmation to the high levels of the Pentagon, because his view has long been that we have no interest in a lot of the wars we fight, including in Ukraine, including in the Middle East. We ought to be focusing on China and the Pacific. And neocon groups that obviously want the United States focused on the Middle East, fighting in the Middle East, funding Ukraine, were desperate to keep him out. There are a few other
Neocons are fine with antagonism toward China too. That's the truth. They align completely on the populist right on that generally.
There's some of those non-interventionists that made it high levels of the Pentagon, like Dan Caldwell, ended up getting fired because they fabricated leaking scandals against them that were completely fake. We'll do a show on that one time. But there are still several of them. And so Elbridge Colby, when he announced this policy, like, look, we were going to ship all these munitions and missiles to Ukraine, but now we can't. The reason we can't, and we have gone over this before, is because U.S. stockpiles are dangerously low. We don't have these missiles and munitions to give, at least not consistent with making sure that we have enough in the case we want to fight another war. And the reasons are obvious. We've been sending missiles and munitions and drones and everything else we have.
Good, I hope everything's depleted, and I hope it was depleted in those foolhardy campaigns in Yemen and Iran, too. We need to stop that. The government needs to stop this because Americans always pay the price for these stupid wars that regular Americans don't want to be a part of. This is all driven by the political class and not working people that just want to provide for themselves and their families. It's bogus, and it needs to stop. I'm glad Glenn is one of the few that really calls this out.
To Ukraine and to Israel to fuel their wars. Israel has multiple wars, not just in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, in Lebanon, in Syria. It's bombed the Houthis many times. Obviously attacked Iran. The United States has been arming and funding and just sending huge amounts of weaponry to Ukraine. And also, remember, President Trump reinstituted and escalated President Biden's campaign of bombing the Houthi.
Yeah.
And the idea was we're going to obliterate the Houthis. And after a month, President Trump got the report and saw how much money we were spending, how many weapons we were using, how much money it was costing, and nothing was really getting done. We were killing a bunch of civilians and not really degrading the Houthis at all.
Yeah, the Houthis have outlasted a decade-long blockade by the U.S., a civil war which involved an invasion by Saudi Arabia, and that lasted, something like 8 years or something, and about 500,000 people dead due to diseases. And, by the end of that whole catastrophe, it might be 1 million people dead due to this stupid U.S. involvement war of choice again in Yemen that no one talks about. And Trump used one of his sole vetoes during his first term to prolong, to continue that war, which started over in Obama's time, essentially. That's what we're dealing with, and thankfully that bombing campaign in March stopped. There's the Signalgate leak controversy and such, but the U.S. needs to withdraw all presence in that region, the blockade entirely. And if they don't, this is going to go on forever too. That's another lucrative venture for the military-industrial complex and the Saudi government, essentially.
And they told him, oh, sir, we just need 9 more months. But he ended it because he saw he was being deceived again. And we're very low on stockpiles, military stockpiles, even though we spend 3 times more than any other country on the planet and more than the next 15 countries combined. And this was one of the reasons why, although we've been told that Iran or Israel and the United States together achieved this massive, glorious victory, war victory, Netanyahu and Trump are war victors, war heroes.
Yeah, that True Social post was nice, calling Netanyahu a war hero. He's, completely obliterating and enacting a genocide in Gaza, slaughtering civilians. Women and children get plucked out of the rubble there, leveling Rafah, establishing what they're calling concentration zones. He's a war hero, according to Trump. And hey, Nessa, you should drop his corruption and fraud charges. That's what Trump said. Well, that's bogus.
Trump called on Netanyahu to be immediately pardoned or have his corruption trial stopped. It's like, look, he just, with me, won a historic war. It's very important for Trump and Israel to insist to people that they won this great war, this historic war in 12 days. The reality is the Israelis really couldn't fight that war for much longer. You saw with fewer and fewer missiles shot by Iran, not even their most sophisticated yet, that more and more were landing. We don't know the full extent of the damage in Israel because journalists will tell you they were absolutely and aggressively censored by the military from showing any hits on government or military buildings. The only things they were allowed to show were the occasional hits by the Iranians on a civilian building here, a residential building there, to create the false impression that they were targeting and only hitting civilian buildings. But Israel suffered a lot of damage. President Trump said that himself.
Yeah, the goal wasn't to keep that war going from a unilateral Israeli perspective. It was to draw the U.S. into it for a regime change operation, which thankfully hasn't gone through yet, and I hope is off the table, but no one can be sure because the neocon influence still exists in our government, and Netanyahu's going to clamor for it. And Netanyahu's going to drum up this propaganda scheme again that they're weeks away from a nuke and hope to draw the U.S. up into it again. And he will have collaborators within the U.S. government, and the military-industrial complex will be all for it. And the Israel lobby will be all for it.
That Israel took a huge pounding. They didn't have air defenses any longer. They were running out, and the United States couldn't continue to supply them. We were running out of our own missiles that we use to shoot down Iranian missiles. Israel and the United States needed an end to that war at least as much as Iran did because we were so low on our stockpiles because we're fighting so many wars or funding so many wars. And so the argument of the Pentagon and Elbridge Colby is, look, we just don't have these weapons to keep giving to Iran. We need them for ourselves. If we keep giving them to Ukraine, if we keep giving them to Ukraine, we're not going to have any on our own, and our priority should be our military and our protection and not Ukraine's. If this were really a difference between Ukraine winning the war, if we give them the weapons, as defined by NATO, which was always a pipe dream, but the definition was expelling every Russian troop from every inch of Ukraine, including Crimea, which the Russians would never, ever allow to happen. But if it were a difference between Ukraine winning or Ukraine just getting rolled over, then I would say, okay, maybe there's a debate to be had. But the reality,
I wouldn't. It's never good to get involved in these entangling alliances. And, that's a fruitless prospect anyway, because it's not even on the table. Russia occupies something like 90% of the Donbass and Crimea. Crimea is not going away. They had a referendum even in either 2014 or 2015 where they said, hey, by a margin of 97%, we don't want to be part of Ukraine. And that's regardless of, the war that broke out there in 2014 after the U.S. overthrew the Yanukovych government. Everyone, that are propagandists, pro-NATO, pro-Western, want to pretend that war began in 2023, but it didn't. It began, or 2022, but it didn't. It began in 2014 because of the U.S. and pushing NATO and overthrowing the government and not holding Ukraine accountable for enforcing the Minsk Accords, which they discarded and would have guaranteed autonomy to the provinces within the Donbass, but Ukraine did not go through with that.
Is we've been feeding them weapons into the 4th year now. It's 4 whole years, coming up on 4 years, 3.5 years of not just the United States sending billions and billions of dollars, but also Europe. And Ukraine hasn't been saved. Ukraine has been destroyed. Ukrainians haven't been freed. They've been slaughtered in mass number. And that's all that's going to happen if we keep sending weapons there.
Yeah.
Now, of course, the Europeans are relying on this fear-mongering that Putin is not going to stop with Ukraine. He wants to eat up all of Ukraine. He's demonstrated many times that he's willing to do a peace deal that secures a buffer zone in eastern Ukraine that protects the ethnic Russians who speak Russian and feel they've been aggressively discriminated against by the Kiev government, the people of Crimea and various provinces in the east feel closer to Moscow than they do to Kiev. They identify as Russians and not Ukrainians. So as long as Russia feels that A, they can protect those people, and B, create a buffer zone between NATO and the West on the one hand and Russia on the other so it can't go right up to their border, they've always said they're willing to reach a deal. And remember, they almost reached a deal, Ukraine and Russia did at the very beginning of the war, that didn't call for the complete sacrifice of Ukrainian sovereignty, but only those kinds of buffer zones.
This is exactly right. Russia has shown a propensity to be willing to negotiate on these things for a peace agreement, and Ukraine has been the entity, under the influence of the U.S. and also Boris Johnson, by the way, of skirting those opportunities. And Zelensky's not going to get a deal like he could have gotten at Istanbul. And if Zelensky wanted Ukraine proper and to take Kyiv and to regime change it completely, he would have to devote immensely more resources and forces than there's any indication that he is. So all this propaganda that he's going to take it tomorrow, Trump's repeated some of it. He said Putin wants to take all of Ukraine, renewing that CNN and Biden and deep state line that we all heard so much, but he doesn't. I'm sorry, Poland's not next. That's ludicrous.
Or semi-autonomous regions, or letting them vote. And that was the deal that Victoria Nuland and Boris Johnson swept in and told Ukraine they can't keep. And they wanted this war to be a prolonged war to destroy Russia. So this fear-mongering that Putin's going to eat up all of Ukraine, and then he's going to move to Poland, and then he's going to, he's like Hitler, he's going to sweep through Eastern Europe and then Central Europe, back to Austria and Germany, and then he's going to go to Paris again. This is idiotic.
Yeah.
The Russians have had a hard time defeating Ukraine, albeit with, obviously, Ukraine's being aggressively backed by NATO. But even if they weren't, they were willing to do a deal that just provides Russian security. But wars always rely on fear-mongering, and so they've convinced a lot of people if we don't back the Ukrainians, Russia's going to just roll over and take over, annex Ukraine, and rebuild the Soviet Union under this kind of view of greater Russia that Putin supposedly has in mind, the way Israel is actually doing, creating greater Israel. And there's so much evidence that contradicts that, so little evidence that supports it, but at the end of the day, where are these people going to come from who are going to fight on the front lines in Ukraine? There aren't many left. We can drown that country with billions of dollars in weapons, and the war is still going to end up the way it's going to end up. You may not like it. It may be sad to you. You may wish it were a different way, but that is just the hard-in reality.
That is. It's hard to discount that notion because the U.S. has poured in $200 billion, and we haven't seen anything more than what's already happened. If it dedicates another $100 billion, it'll probably be much the same. But this is designed to go on forever, just like all the forever wars. They're not designed to be won. They're designed to be endless, so that the grift can continue by the military-industrial complex and the bomb makers, and the U.S. can sell this as some kind of victory for the United States, that we're defending democracy, when, the guy running Ukraine's not the biggest advocate of democracy, banning political parties, shutting down Eastern Orthodox churches, expanding conscription mandates, ushering in martial law, shutting down oppositional media. He's no pro-democratic force whatsoever.
And there have been experts saying it very bravely because they were... Jeffrey Sachs used to go on Morning Joe all the time, until he started saying this, and he hasn't been on again. People get booted out of mainstream platforms. They get called all sorts of names, Russian agents, Kremlin propaganda, etc. But who cares? Those people were the ones who were absolutely right, which is why we kept putting them on our show. They were by far the most convincing people. And that is the nature of the war in Ukraine and the U.S. role in it. Even if we wanted to keep supplying the weapons, we simply don't have it because we've been fueling and arming far too many wars, our own, Israel's, Ukraine's, and that's what happens.
Yeah, Glenn is completely accurate here. It's the John Mearsheimers and the Jeffrey Sachses and Colonel McGregors that have been proven right about this war time and time again. That no matter how much U.S. money is thrown into it, how much propaganda is drummed up, they're not dislodging the Russians from the Donbass. $200 billion later, maybe 1 million Ukrainian lives later, maybe tens of thousands of Russian lives later, we're still in the same general spot, and it doesn't benefit the Americans in any way imaginable. Instead, it creates animosities with the biggest nuclear power in the world, the one with the biggest nuclear arsenal. You know, a country that the U.S. should just trade with and end its stupid sanctions regime against. Normalize relations. This is not the USSR. You know, despite all the propaganda that, you know, he's going to go into Western Europe and take Poland after Ukraine, and France, as Glenn said, is total garbage. These are not the purveyors of Stalinism and the USSR. This is just absurd propaganda designed to draw out this war, which again, as Julian Assange pointed out in Afghanistan, it's never that they won a successful war. The goal for Afghanistan wasn't a successful war. It was an endless war. And guess which theater has taken the place of Afghanistan? It's Ukraine. So Trump needs to get his senses to him and stop involving Lindsey Graham and his mentality toward this war prevail in terms of U.S. policy. Withdraw all aid from Ukraine. Prevent Ukraine from being part of NATO. Be very explicit about that. That's the reddest of red lines, and we know that from the Burns memo, the Niet means Niet memo that was disclosed by WikiLeaks and Assange. We know that. But, you know, we keep inventing these new concepts to try to draw out this war if you're part of the war propaganda machine. Well, no more. I say it needs to discontinue. Hopefully Trump's finally getting his senses to him and stopping these munitions, but we've seen him do this and then restore aid a few days later. That happened back at the beginning of his presidency. So we'll have to see how this turns out. Let me know in the comments below, do you agree with me and Glenn's assessment on this? Do you think a peace is on the horizon? How much longer do you think Ukraine can continue fighting? I want to hear from you on that. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Please also consider becoming a YouTube member. If you do, you will get advanced viewing of all my videos on YouTube before they come out live, and you do support the channel that way. And I bow to you in appreciation if you go that length. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.